In June 1996, I delivered a message to an audience in Northern Virginia about then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I offered a brief history about Mr. Gingrich and his political performance based on his voting record and public statements. I then predicted that under his leadership there would be no rollback of the enormous growth of federal government. Sadly, many well-meaning conservatives across the country continued to cheer his rhetoric, despite the fact that his actions clearly demonstrated that he was no friend of limited government under the Constitution. In the late 1990s, House Speaker Gingrich stepped down from his position and faded somewhat from the limelight. Recently, however, there has been a resurgence in voter outrage across the country over an out-of-control government. It developed because of a number of bailouts and a further nationalization of our already over-regulated economy. And just as in the early 1990s, Newt Gingrich is back in the news and is positioning himself to take advantage of voter backlash. Who is Newt Gingrich and what does he stand for? In this video presentation, we go back to our 1996 analysis and offer some up-to-date comments about his reemergence as a national leader. I begin by contrasting the Gingrich performance of 15 years ago with that of another congressman from Georgia, Dr. Larry McDonald. It was in 1974 that the late Larry McDonald won his seat in Congress as a Democrat. To him, being a Democrat or a Republican mattered little because he believed the basic standard for any American should be the Constitution of the United States. He never intended to take his direction from a speaker or a party leader if it conflicted. His commitment was to the Constitution. Once in office, McDonald quickly demonstrated that he would keep the promise he had made to the voters, that he would be guided solely by the document to which he'd sworn a solemn oath. He also became a significant force, leading other congressmen from both political parties to do likewise. In 1978, 4 years after McDonald won his seat in the House, the people of Georgia elected Newt Gingrich, a Republican, as the congressman from a nearby district. Reputed to be a strict conservative, he was the first Republican from Georgia to serve in the Congress in the 20th century. Let's take a look at the Gingrich performance right from his earliest days in Congress. The September 19, 1979 Constitution-based Conservative Index shows McDonald with a 100% score and Gingrich with only 80%. Gingrich earned deficient marks in this rating period for voting for the creation of a Department of Education and for designating 68 million acres of mineral-rich land in Alaska as a federally protected wilderness. McDonald correctly maintained that there is no authorization in the U.S. Constitution for federal involvement in education. He also knew that a former leader of the American Communist Party named William Z. Foster called for a federal Department of Education by name in his 1932 book, Toward Soviet America. Among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are a National Department of Education. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught on the basis of Marxian dialectical materialism, internationalism, and the general ethics of the new socialist society. The measure creating the Federal Department of Education passed in the House by 210 to 206. A shift of 3 votes, therefore, would have defeated it. Ever since its creation, educational standards in America have plummeted. But Gingrich voted for something that the Constitution doesn't permit and the communists wanted. And he wasn't alone, because the Department of Education was also eagerly sought by then-President Jimmy Carter. Regarding the Gingrich vote for locking up huge portions of the state of Alaska, we see again that the Constitution contains no authorization for federal land control. But there is an explicit call for land control in the very first of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. The famous document crafted by Marx and Engels in 1848 calls for abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. The way our nation is being run, all land will soon be owned or controlled by the federal government. Marx wanted land control, a progressive income tax, termination of the rights of inheritance, a central bank, which is precisely what the Federal Reserve is, and government control of education. There are even explicit attacks in the manifesto on private property, the family, marriage, and homeschooling. The federal land grab should have been stopped years ago, but it wasn't, and it continues to the point where huge percentages of the territory of each of the 13 western states is now federally owned. The April 9th, 1980 Conservative Index again shows McDonald with a perfect 100% score and Gingrich with supporting the grant of Most Favored Nation status to Communist China. Most Favored Nation status for Communist China has enabled the tyrants who run that nation to flood America with slave labor goods, steal American jobs, and build up the treasury of the most murderous regime the world has ever seen. In the 13 years since I delivered that speech, the flight of American jobs to China only increased. And according to a first quarter 2009 Department of Treasury report, China has become the world's largest holder of U.S. debt, about $800 billion worth. Press reports from late 2008 and early 2009 revealed that Chinese officials are nervous about the amount of U.S. debt that they hold. Because of that, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton recently traveled to China to implore Chinese officials to continue propping up the dollar. All of this dependence on China started nearly 3 decades ago when the U.S. Congress granted China Most Favored Nation status, and Newt Gingrich voted for it. The people of Georgia thought that they had elected a stalwart anti-communist and conservative in Gingrich, but this was another early indication that they had not. There would be plenty more. It is also important to realize that dozens of congressmen had the same 100% score as McDonald during these rating periods. Gingrich would later vote to supply funds to promote trade with the Soviets, to transfer 2.2 million acres in Idaho to federal wilderness status, to arrange for federally funded loan guarantees to facilitate greater trade with Red China, to make taxpayer funds available to foreign governments through the Export-Import Bank, to grant amnesty to illegal immigrants, and to continue the costly monstrosity known as foreign aid. Gingrich did cast some votes that any constitutionalist could support, but the specific votes I have mentioned are those which clearly separated the Constitution's men from the establishment's boys. There were many more votes of this variety. For example, in 1994, before he became Speaker, Gingrich voted for funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, for an extra $1.2 billion for UN peacekeeping, for a presidential line item veto, for $13 billion in foreign aid, and for $166 million more for the IRS. In 1995, he voted for $31.8 billion in foreign aid, but could not bring himself to vote in a different bill to cut foreign aid by a measly 1%. From the earliest days in Congress, Gingrich was never the hardcore conservative enemy of the establishment's drive for big government, even world government. I recall asking Larry McDonald about Gingrich 15 years ago. The prompt response I received was his assessment that Gingrich couldn't be trusted, was extremely ambitious, and would compromise principles whenever doing so would advance his own career. McDonald considered him a candidate for membership in the establishment that is leading our nation away from its foundations and into central control. Newt Gingrich is now touted as the leader of the conservative movement, supposedly the much-needed alternative to Bill Clinton and the forces of big government. Time magazine named him Man of the Year and called him exceptional, brilliant, amazing. The magazine even characterized him as the key individual who will arrange to have, quote, power flowing out of Washington devolving to the states, unquote. That, of course, hasn't happened because it was never intended to happen. But who is the real Newt Gingrich? William F. Jasper included a telling glimpse of the early Gingrich career in an article from the New American Magazine in December of 1994. Jasper reported what the current biography yearbook for 1989 revealed about the speaker. This publication's short bio sketch began by noting that after Gingrich graduated from Emory University in 1965, he received advanced degrees from Tulane University in 1968 and in 1971. He then became a professor at a state college in Georgia. But then the current biography yearbook for 1989 stated the following: his behavior at Tulane appeared to belie his future conservatism and hawkish foreign policy views. He accepted student deferments rather than face the draft during the Vietnam War, experimented with marijuana, led a campus demonstration defending the school paper's right to print a nude photograph of a faculty member, and campaigned for Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller of New York in 1968. Well, to put it mildly, these are not the credentials one would expect to find in a principled conservative. No campaigner for Nelson Rockefeller could ever seriously be characterized as a conservative. When the Republicans won control of the Congress in the elections of 1994, Gingrich had already risen to the position of deputy party leader in the House. He therefore had the inside track to become Speaker. Because he was about to become the most powerful man in the entire Congress, a great deal of attention came his way. Ever the brash professor, he produced a list of 8 books he wanted fellow members of Congress to read. One was the Declaration of Independence. Another was the Federalist Papers, written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. But the Constitution was not on his list. Another of the books that Gingrich recommended made many sit up and take notice. It was this one, The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler, originally published in 1980 and reissued in 1994 by the New Age Promoting Progress and Freedom Foundation in Washington. Who is Alvin Toffler, and what did he promote in his book that Gingrich found to be so important that he would so highly recommend it? Toffler believes that mankind is entering a completely new phase of development, the third wave, if you will. To adapt to this new development, Toffler urged a whole new system of government for America because he believes that the old system just can't work anymore. He began the final chapter of his book with a letter addressed to the founding parents, which is what he called the founding fathers. To Washington, Franklin, Adams, Madison, Jefferson, and others, he wrote, quote, "For the system of government you fashioned, including the very principles on which you based it, is increasingly obsolete and hence increasingly, if inadvertently, oppressive and dangerous to our welfare. It must be radically changed and a new system of government invented, a democracy for the 21st century," end quote. Toffler closed by stating, quote, "For this wisdom, above all, I thank Mr. Jefferson, who helped create the system that served us so well for so long, and that now must, in its turn, die and be replaced," end quote. So, Newt Gingrich's highly recommended friend urges the death of the American constitutional system. Obviously, Gingrich agrees. The principles undergirding the Constitution were sound when there were 4 million Americans in an agriculture-based society more than 200 years ago, and they are no less sound today when there are 260 million Americans in a highly industrialized society. And let's add that they will still apply when there are even more Americans in any information-based society or any other kind of society envisioned by the Tofflers or anyone else. How many Americans there are and how they earn a living aren't the most fundamental considerations. We are still human beings possessed of a nature that doesn't change. And that realization 200 years ago led to the Constitution, and that Constitution ushered in the greatest nation in the history of the world. Gingrich even wrote a foreword to Alvin and Heidi Toffler's book entitled Creating a New Civilization. His relationship with the Tofflers goes back over many years, and he knows their thinking very well. Only a few days after the Republican triumph in 1994, Gingrich told a press conference, quote, "The best description of me is that I'm a conservative futurist. Mary Ann and I have for a long time been friends of Alvin and Heidi Toffler, the authors of Future Shock and the Third Wave." Now, this man, who is the Speaker of the House, has repeatedly sworn an oath to adhere to the strict limitations in the U.S. Constitution. He has sworn this oath every second year at the beginning of each new Congress in which he has served. Yet, he rather brazenly endorses an attitude which holds that the document he's pledged to abide by is obsolete and must die and be replaced. In 1995, Gingrich authored his own book, To Renew America. Now, as I understand it, the word renew means to reinvigorate and not discard what was once new. My dictionary even supplies the word restore as a synonym. If America is to be restored politically and in numerous other ways, it stands to reason that its foundations would be given a new emphasis. It stands to reason that getting back to the Constitution would be the basis of the renewal. But Gingrich's book mentions the Constitution only once, merely to acknowledge that it exists. Let's go back to the mid-1970s. In 1974, Larry McDonald won his seat in the Congress. This was the year that Newt Gingrich started running for Congress. It took him 3 tries before he finally made it. But 1974 was also the year when the incredibly subversive article, The Hard Road to World Order, was published in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. This article was written by CFR heavyweight Richard N. Gardner. It lamented that a single leap into world government wasn't possible, so he brazenly called for, quote, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, end quote. He even stated that the end run approach could produce some remarkable concessions of sovereignty that could not be achieved on an across-the-board basis. Among the numerous recommendations to accomplish this end run, Gardner, as far back as 1974, remember, he called for disarmament programs, a UN military force, additional authority for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and new and broader enforcement powers to go along with membership in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Now, no one from the Council on Foreign Relations has ever repudiated these explicit Gardner-authored attacks on national sovereignty. Instead, the CFR's journal has published other, less subtle assaults. But the overall goal remains the same. The Council on Foreign Relations wants to push the United States into a world government. And as many Americans have begun to discover, the CFR crowd has been getting its way for many, many years. So it came as little surprise to see the name Newton L. Gingrich listed as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the beginning of 1990. And this organization was founded in 1921 for the purpose of creating a world government and abolishing national independence. Jump ahead now to the fall of 1994, 20 years after the Gardner article in Foreign Affairs magazine. CFR member Gingrich's Republican Party has just won a huge victory in the 1994 congressional races. He's in line to be Speaker of the House. What does he do? He acquiesces in the convening of a lame duck session of Congress. Then he uses his considerable muscle to have Congress pass an important measure leading to the demise of this nation's sovereignty, much deeper involvement for the United States in GATT. He has already helped to get NAFTA passed. In both of these efforts, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Bill Clinton, another member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Numerous congressmen and newly elected representatives said that anything as important to the United States as submitting to GATT's World Trade Organization shouldn't be decided by defeated congressmen in a lame duck session. They wanted any vote on the matter to be postponed until the new Congress convened in January of 1995. They said that the issue should be decided by the newly elected members of Congress who reflected the current attitude of the American people, which attitude had just resoundingly been registered in the congressional elections. Early in 1994, Newt Gingrich testified before the House Ways and Means Committee. Listen to what he said about the plan to expand GATT's powers. Quote, "We need to be honest about the fact that we are transferring from the United States significant authority to a new organization. This is a transformational moment. This is not just another trade agreement. This is a very big transfer of power." End quote. This assessment of what was planned for GATT is absolutely correct. It's why the Council on Foreign Relations wanted the United States to submit to the trade bloc's regulatory powers. GATT has established a gigantic bureaucracy called the World Trade Organization, which is now the sole interpreter of 20,000 pages of trade regulations for 120 nations. This WTO essentially has life and death authority over America's economic interests. But the Constitution grants power to Congress and to Congress alone to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And Congress has no authority to delegate its powers to any other body. But with Newt Gingrich leading the way, GATT and its World Trade Organization have been given this power. We've also learned that GATT will meddle in such matters as reducing the amount of money U.S. citizens can put aside for pensions. A headline from the December 5th, 1994 Wall Street Journal, the establishment newspaper that openly urged Congress to approve the GATT Accord. The headline reads, "GATT law to reduce amount Americans can save for pensions." What are we to think when Newt Gingrich, the supposed alternative to a revolutionary Bill Clinton, joins the president in New Hampshire in June of 1995 for a love feast debate where not one of Mr. Clinton's many deficiencies were aired? Instead of using the nationally televised opportunity to point out the harmful policies being offered by the president and the reforms America really needs, Gingrich told the audience in Claremont, New Hampshire, that he was a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt and a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. This is an alternative to Bill Clinton? In March 1995, Gingrich gave a speech at the Nixon Center for Peace and Security. After praising himself for his role in the NAFTA and GATT measures, getting them through Congress, he told his audience that the United States must lead all over the world. His remarks caused The Economist to feature him in an article entitled "The Internationalists." But he's not supposed to be an internationalist. He's supposed to be a defender of the independence of the United States. Hardly a day goes by without some attack in the media complaining about isolationism. And this is exactly the topic that the British article addressed in its revealing portrait of Gingrich. Here's what it said. If Mr. Clinton and Gingrich, as good internationalists, want to keep this isolation in check, they have work to do in their own parties. Strange as it may seem in these days of loud contrast politics, on this issue they are actually on the same side. On January 20th, 1995, Secretary of State Warren Christopher delivered a foreign policy speech at Harvard University. After the speech, Christopher, who went from vice chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations into the Clinton cabinet, was asked by a television reporter for his assessment of Newt Gingrich. His one-word answer, given with a wry smile, was internationalist. There are few who would know better than Warren Christopher the full meaning of that one-word description. But haven't traditional-minded Americans been told repeatedly that Gingrich is their champion? That he will always put America first? That he is a tough, no-nonsense American? That he will lead the revolution against big government? Sad to say, the facts speak otherwise again and again. The CFR membership of Speaker Gingrich places him alongside President Clinton, Secretary of State Christopher, and over 500 other U.S. government officials who share membership in this seat of internationalist establishment power. In July 1995, the New York Times featured Gingrich in a front-page article whose headline labeled him a foreign policy novice. But the Times delighted in pointing out that Gingrich's favorite foreign policy mentor is Henry Kissinger. It claimed that Kissinger is doing a good job schooling the speaker. Kissinger, the architect of much of America's disastrous foreign policy over recent years, is another member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It certainly follows that he is a huge promoter of international trade entanglements such as NAFTA and GATT, both backed by Newt Gingrich. Also in July 1995, Gingrich gave a speech at the Center for Strategic and International Affairs. In it he said, quote, "The American challenge in leading the world is compounded by our Constitution," end quote. He suggested that we would have to rethink our Constitution. He also told his audience, "I believe in a very strong central government. You can have a very strong but limited federal government." No, you can't. The founders wanted the central government weak, not strong. It was to be tied down to merely protecting rights. In April 1996, President Clinton signed the new federal budget. While doing so, he repeatedly thanked congressional leaders, Speaker Gingrich and Senate Majority Leader Dole, for backing down and not scrapping an array of government programs that should be scrapped. He went out of his way to heap praise on these Republicans. He said he was pleased that Congress restored the programs, followed his urging regarding others, and adopted recommendations for some more. These programs, all of which were supposed to be terminated according to Gingrich, include oppressive environmental laws, the National Service Program, the United Nations-inspired Goals 2000 program for America's schools, federal financing of local police, and UN peacekeeping missions for our nation's military. A very astute observer of American politics recently summarized the difficult situation facing good congressmen who seek re-election in 1996. Gingrich has achieved something almost unthinkable. He has kept Republican freshmen from being conservative and yet set them up for possible defeat in November for being too conservative. That takes brilliance. Early in 1996, freshman Republican Congressman John Hostetler of Indiana wrote a letter to Gingrich and released it to the press. It said, "I am today declining your unsolicited offer to attend a fundraiser in southwestern Indiana to benefit my re-election." Hostetler felt he was better off getting ready for re-election on his own than having Gingrich by his side. And that attitude has spread amongst the very best of the Republicans in the House.
Not only did Gingrich use his brilliance to keep Republican freshmen from being conservative, some of the best Republican conservatives turned down his support for their re-election. In the revealing case of Dr. Ron Paul, who in 1996 sought to regain a seat in Congress after having a decade of not serving, Newt Gingrich did everything possible to keep him from returning to Washington. Gingrich went out of his way to get 50 members of Congress to endorse Dr. Paul's opponent in the Texas primary. Even former President George H.W. Bush campaigned for Dr. Paul's opponent at Gingrich's request. Despite all of Gingrich's efforts, Dr. Paul did win the primary and the election and did return to Congress. Why would the supposed leader of the conservative movement work to keep one of the Constitution's most stalwart defenders away from Washington, D.C.? The answer is that Gingrich is one of many who want to be known as a conservative, an undefined and shifting attitude. Many so-called conservatives today don't care to be reminded that there really is a Constitution that limits government power. Dr. Paul is more a constitutionalist than a conservative.
Congressmen who do care about the Constitution have been complaining about being called on the carpet by Gingrich for disloyalty. Disloyalty to what? Not to the Constitution, but to the party and to the leadership of the party. Was the Constitution ever mentioned? Not on your life. Americans have been talked out of the Constitution and its limitations on government power. Repeatedly, we are expected to make judgments based on someone being labeled either conservative or liberal, terms that are not defined. Today, a man with a record like Gingrich's can be described as a conservative. Henry Kissinger has announced that he's a conservative. You get an idea of how much substance this term conveys after examining the records of those whom the media brands conservative and keeps telling us that they are conservatives. In truth, the term conservative has been co-opted by big government, by New World Order advocates, and by closet socialists. We hear a great deal of talk in our country today about the need to balance the federal budget. Right now, the accumulated national debt exceeds $5 trillion. It costs $300 billion per year for interest. So what do our leaders propose? Democrat and Republican leaders tell us they plan to balance the budget in 7 years. This means that for at least 6 more years, they plan to add to the national debt and to the interest bill borne by the taxpayers. The John Birch Society believes that the budget can be balanced in a matter of months. 2 very easily understood steps would get the job done. First step, terminate all foreign aid, including Mexican-style bailouts. All of it is completely unconstitutional to begin with, and it hardly makes sense for a nation so heavily indebted as ours to be giving away money. And the second step would be to bring the troops home. Why should we be absorbing the defense budget for Japan and South Korea and Germany and Italy and so many other countries? Bring the troops home and restate that their sole mission is the protection of the life, liberty, and property of the American people. Some will call that isolationism, but I'm not an isolationist, and I don't think you are either. What are we? We're non-interventionists with the sons and the daughters and the wallets of the American people. The John Birch Society wants the people of this nation to be free to deal with the people of other nations, with little or no government involvement. We are prone to quote the great English leader Richard Cobden, who stated a century and a half ago, "Peace will come to this earth when her peoples have as much as possible to do with each other, their governments the least possible." Americans all across this land must realize that they are being persuaded to follow false leaders, to put confidence in men who don't deserve your confidence, and to adopt as a standard virtually meaningless media characterizations, conservative and liberal, instead of the Constitution. Understanding the real Newt Gingrich and others like him is essential. It's time for a change.
A large and growing number of Americans are becoming rightfully alarmed about the direction our country is heading. Newt Gingrich is positioning himself, and the establishment media is suggesting him as the leader of this resistance. Americans should know more about this man and others like him to avoid being duped by false leaders who masquerade as friends of freedom when they are in fact internationalists and closet advocates of big government.